Hello all, and welcome back to One Spooked Professor. Today we're going to be diving into Gothic horror. Yay, team. This is really the origin of modern horror, and the Gothic literary movements in general are what fed into a lot of the genres that we would recognize as they are today. Science fiction, mystery, horror in many of its forms, including even cosmic horror, all have roots in what you would recognize today as Gothic literature, Gothic fiction. Naturally, since this is a horror podcast, we're going to be looking at Gothic horror, but at times this is just going to intersect with the movement as a whole. This is going to be mostly an overview of Gothic horror and its influence. I want to actually spend some time with the particular works in question, like Dracula and Frankenstein, in their own little episodes, especially since they're so important and influential. But if I'm going to talk about things like Dracula, Frankenstein, hillbilly horror, cosmic horror, and all of the derivatives, children, and bastard offspring of Gothic horror, it would be useful to have some understanding of Gothic horror. So let's dive into this little malformed, incestuous bastard, shall we? And I mean that with a great deal of love, because Gothic horror has really grown on me. And I will admit that during my first postgraduate degree, where I was dealing with a lot of literature, a lot of my focus was on the modern and on antiquity. So I read a lot of Greek and Roman works and modernist and postmodernist works, and it was on my own time where I got to do a lot of research into works that have roots in medievalism or a part of the Renaissance and things like that. So a lot of this research comes from my own time rather than what I studied in my first postgraduate degree. I would also like to advise you that if you're interested in the other movements related to the notion of what is Gothic, like the architectural style, types of fashion, or philosophical and political movements often associated with these artistic movements, there is plenty to find here on YouTube and plenty out there in books. Yes, go hunt down a good book, even if you have to do so through your e-reader. But I would like to point out that even the name itself is something of a construction. The term Goth refers to the Ostrogoths and Visigoths, the people that destroyed the Roman Empire, or rather transformed it depending on your particular perception of history. And this notion of this literary movement and its corresponding other cultural movements and architectural and artistic movements does carry a sense of the barbaric in the eyes of those who are part of the Enlightenment movement. It looks backward in many ways. So the term Gothic does have some connection to the Goths. It's just very much separated by time and space. But it does look backwards, and that's going to become important later. You'll notice that in the architectural movements, there's a sense of awe and disorder that is a very core component of how many religious structures were produced. There's a sense of the archaic and of grandeur. This is also something to keep in mind when you're looking at connections between all of these Gothic movements. All right, let's dive into Gothic horror. Now, Gothic horror, in many ways, was a part of the Romantic movement we would recognize in Gothic fiction, which is a reaction to the Enlightenment in many ways. When you had the Renaissance, Western thinking turned to sort of the glorification of antiquity, and you see this sort of cultural fixation with the idea of revitalization, of bringing back these old ideas and creating something new out of it. And the Enlightenment took this pass and carried on with it towards the end zone. I assume that is an accurate sports metaphor. I didn't learn what a quarterback was until my junior year in undergrad. And I still get calls from my parents going, "Do you know what a quarterback is yet? Do you know what a quarterback is yet?" I do now. Thank you very much. I only recently learned what a shortstop was, but hey, we're all making progress, and sports is not my field of expertise. When it comes to something sports related, help me. I'm helpless. Except for tennis. That I played very well once upon a time. Wow, that really makes me sound like a cliche douchebag there. Moving on. Anyway, I'm not going to jump into arguments about when the Age of Enlightenment began. It is firm, though, that it emerged from Renaissance humanism, that it was definitely influenced by the scientific revolution, and it looked forward or aimed to look forward while also being a mix of contradictions. It's often characterized by rational and logical philosophies and kind of a hopeful optimism of progress. And indeed, the notion of progress as we recognize it is inevitably bound to the Age of Enlightenment, because the Age of Enlightenment is realistically one of the first societies that is so markedly different in terms of the changes from one generation to another, that it was in many ways not living in the same sort of world and life as the those that came before it. So, in many ways, there are the ideas that the lessons of the past had limited value. There's this urge to discard false ideas, misconceptions, do away with the old, in with the new. And what is old that is valuable often came from classical antiquity. You see this veneration of the Romans and the Greeks still to some degree remaining, particularly the values of logos, their study of the sciences and mathematics and things like that. The Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment are also responsible for that larger meta narrative which constructs the downfall of the Western Roman Empire and the transition of late antiquity into the Dark Ages as being a time of decay, and the Renaissance as being a time of renewal. There are some historians who would argue this, to point out that while, yes, population density and comfort levels decreased after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire existed for quite some time as Byzantium, and many forms of technology still existed and progressed. To pit a Roman legionnaire from late antiquity against a 15th century French knight, see who has better equipment, I dare you, and things like that. So this is more of a literary conceit than one that is universally backed up by history, even though there are obvious signs of the civilized world falling apart. Certainly, learning was less available, at least on a widespread level, and the cities also depopulated. And if you look at pottery and certain comforts and luxury goods, they saw a considerable decline in quality for some time. The Pax Romana that existed also ceased to be, and you see a lot of institutional anarchy, though institutional anarchy was a reality of much of the early Roman world as well. So what's important here to understand is this idea of progress, this notion of classical restrained values, and the idea of enlightenment being based around learning and improvement of society as a whole. And this coincides with the Industrial Revolution, which changed a whole hell of a lot for people. Oh my goodness. Jobs that used to exist and be in families for a long time simply ceased to be, replaced by other things that were more economical. Standardization destroyed many forms of art while producing reasonably good quality goods at pretty good prices and at numbers previously thought impossible. There were many benefits to technology. There were unfortunately many consequences, just from terrible worker safety laws and health conditions to houses made with poisonous and dangerous items, and to systemic political and governmental processes that would ignore a lot of people. Warfare also changed, becoming something that it recognizably could lead to a lot more casualties, as this becomes particularly important post-French Revolution. But the world was changing, and when the world changes, it tends to leave people behind and destroy a lot of what came before it. There was a great deal of suffering despite emphasis on new political values, or at least the reemergence of old political values that have been retooled. You see a lot more systemic and rational analysis in the Enlightenment and less emphasis on the individual. You see utilitarianism and philosophy similar to that receive a lot of support, while traditional individualist values are challenged. And naturally enough, a lot of people reacted to this poorly. And this is what led us to the Romantic movement, which was in many ways a reaction to the Enlightenment. And by romantic, I don't mean love story, though many love stories are romantic because they emphasize emotion, aesthetic experience, idealization, and individualism. But if you actually look at what we mean by romanticism as a belief structure, you get more of what I'm talking about. It's a complex series of artistic, musical, intellectual, philosophical movements in Europe that realistically developed in the 18th century and in many ways are characterized by that aforementioned emphasis on emotion, aesthetic experience, individualism. There's a glorification of the past, a love of nature. Medievalism rather than classicalism tended to reassert itself, while interestingly at the same time there being many challenges to the aristocratic norms and conventions of the Enlightenment and the dehumanizing aspects of scientific rationalization. All things that often we look at as modern. I find the etymology of this word to be interesting, considering its emphasis on medievalism, the movement's emphasis on medievalism over antiquity, yet the name for the movement draws from the term Roman-esque or Roman-like. So it's fittingly a bit paradoxical, just like the Age of Enlightenment was. I mean, the Age of Enlightenment had many paradoxes. You had this idea of human progress and logic supposedly leading to better lives and humanistic values. Meanwhile, the institutions of slavery and colonialism would expand and retract in different areas. You had slavery in the New World become bigger than ever because of things like the cotton gin, which revived and empowered the American institution of slavery in a way that is unique throughout history. Now, slavery has been rather ubiquitous throughout history up until this point, and similarly of interest in this whole paradox, while the Industrial Revolution and Age of Enlightenment led to a greater emphasis in America on slavery, you would see the abolitionist movement really take shape here in Europe. And there have been no abolitionist movements throughout history on this scale either. So this whole push and pull movement that defined the Enlightenment is present here. And this will be important to horror. Keep this in mind. When you're looking at human suffering and how our stories are going to reflect it, it's all going to come back around in horror. I'm getting there. You're already decaying like a house in a Gothic horror story just listening to me talk about all this history. So let's get moving. With this emphasis on morality over simple logical thinking and emotion and experience over simple systems and this idea of progress and the idea that perhaps progress could take you in some dark directions, and that there may indeed be such things as evil and dark mysteries in the corners of the world that science alone is not equipped to handle or has not revealed to us. All of this feeds into elements of Gothic horror. Ta-da! Now we're here. Now, many of the authors that we often look at as being the most important ones, at least in American education systems, the most important ones in the Gothic horror literary canon, people like Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, and Edgar Allan Poe, these were writers that came very late to the movement. The actual movement sees its beginnings with people like Horace Walpole, who reintroduced mysticism into horror. He actively rejected realist notions that were part and parcel of the Enlightenment, and he created that kind of basic plot line that would become a pattern in a lot of other Gothic tales. He loved his mysteries, you had ancestral curses, and you had themes of decay and decadence. Oh my. Even some hidden passages. There are even parts of the work, the Castle of Otranto, I think I'm saying that right, Castle of Otranto, that would be elements you'd see used in later works, like you often had some mystery even built around the publication. In this case, he used a fictitious translator. And naturally enough, for an author breaking the rules, he received quite a bit of backlash, especially after he was outed as the author, and there were many critics who rejected it because the romanticism was immoral or broken or old-fashioned, or, and you can come up with many different words here for how they regarded it, but it's met many of the same sorts of emotional reactions in critics that you could see in the modern era when a work pops out and it doesn't match with the mainstream morality or view of the time. There is a cultural reaction against it, regardless of its quality or lack thereof. The judgment, it came on a rather cultural level, particularly the accusations that it was steeped in superstition. Learning and logic and fact and reason are all the rage in these days, so anything that could be considered an attack on that or didn't have a rational explanation in the narrative. And if you look at how narratives work within culture, they are often either a tool of an existing culture continuing to survive and propagate itself, or a tool to critique that culture. And this story didn't really fit with the whole Age of Enlightenment progress thing. The blend of history and fiction, oh no, that did not go down well. That whole fake translator thing that was an artistic convention, also seen as a bit of deception they did not like. Ghosts and prophecies retiring to religion, oh hell no. There's a lot of oh hell no for people who are part of the Age of the Enlightenment. But he still could arguably be called the father of Gothic horror in England. Now, there are other traditions like Gothic horror in English writing that appear throughout Europe as well. They'll never receive that designation in Russia, but you'll see it pop up in a lot of other European countries. Particularly, I'd like to point out the fixation with secret cults in Germany. This becomes a very common trope in Gothic horror as well, that will survive all the way through up into cosmic horror and things like that. Anne Radcliffe is also probably one of the most important early writers in Gothic horror, particularly in that she kind of built a bridge between people who wanted that supernatural medievalism and those who wanted the more logical explanation. We call this the explained supernatural, where things that appear to be supernatural and magical actually have explanations in real life, and this tradition is very much alive today. And you can see it in a lot of games that deal with the classical. And it's almost kind of come around full circle in that supernatural things require a logical explanation, which in turn becomes almost supernatural on its own. You can see this in the Assassin's Creed series, where you have this whole pseudo-mythical alien technological mumbo-jumbo going on that creates things that the people in the past would have considered magical. But the technological explanation is so supernatural in general and follows the rules of the supernatural seemingly, and doesn't seem to abide by scientific principles as far as I can see, that it's basically the same thing. The explanation of super science becomes an excuse to use superstition again. And this you can all date back to Anne Radcliffe. She is also, if not the first woman that entered into Gothic horror, the trendsetter for a lot of women who wrote in Gothic horror. And the Gothic movement in general is interestingly characterized by a high number of female writers, something that you don't see in a lot of classical and Renaissance and even medieval, although again, medieval writings are rather limited because of the limits of learning, works. because of the availability of education, the freedoms afforded to women, and the accessibility of literature for women. You have a large amount of aristocratic and what we would consider above low class, maybe middle class women who needed entertainment and were willing to pay for it. This created demand among women readers and produced women writers. Female Gothic narratives often included themes related towards women as the victims of aggressive masculine figures. You would often see a villainous father figure, search of an absent mother, and a lot less emphasis on the breaking of social taboos and a lot more emphasis on what it was like to be a woman in society or the female driven sub societies within the larger culture, and even sexual desire. You'd see a lot of sex symbolism and discussion going on here, usually through metaphor, symbolism, and just about any other tool that they had at their disposal that they could get out there. Rape and incest become constant themes in Gothic horror, particularly when written by women, and a lot of the supernatural or explained supernatural events are related to these things and to the horrors of women interacting with the wider world. And you could often see relation to the social conventions attached to women or some of the things that they must fear and deal with in their lives, like entrapment, the fear of being chained to the domestic life, the horrors that could afflict the female body, childbirth, the issues of marriage. Oh, don't forget domestic abuse. That one's always there. And of course, rape, incest, the limits of male power, things like that. You have all of these that become present in the works of Gothic women writers. And note that there is considerable variety among these writers. Not all of them share the same perspective or views on these things. Shocker, that's what happens when people are able to lend words to their voice and get them out there. You're going to find their experiences have many similarities and many differences. But you can see the sort of female Gothic writer identity appearing. But this is not the only thing that often goes on in the Gothic literary movement. And you can see that in the creation of the Byronic hero. While the groundwork for this hero was laid by the aforementioned Anne Radcliffe, it gets its name from Lord Byron, and it's one of the most common figures that you will see in romantic fiction, in Gothic horror, and in works afterwards. Note that it is equally possible for the Byronic hero to be the villain of the work or its heroic protagonist, which can make the term Byronic hero a bit misleading. And indeed, not all of the elements of the Byronic hero need to be present for a figure to be considered a Byronic hero. Generally speaking, if we are looking at the traditional understanding of the Byronic hero, the character will be idealized but deeply flawed. They'll have great talent of some kind, great passion for something, a distaste for society and social institutions. There will often be a considerable sense of disrespect or disregard for rank and privilege, although you can bet your bohunkus that the Byronic hero will have both. So they'll be like, the advantages that these people get, it's unfair, and it makes no sense while having those advantages themselves. They will often fall in love and have that love fall through because of some sort of social constraint, death, malaise, or ancient curse. Anything like that, including that person you fall in love with being your sister. All of those things may stop the Byronic hero's love. There's often association with themes of revolution, rebellion, exile, and the Byronic hero will almost always have some sort of deep secret, usually associated with their past. But hey, it can be something as simple as, I'm a vampire, I'm a werewolf, I'm actually Satan's bastard Uncle Joe. That one I don't think appears in any piece of Gothic horror, but it should. It definitely should. The Byronic hero will often be overconfident. They may not show a lot of common sense. Foresight, hindsight, who cares? And no matter what, the Byronic figure generally suffers from some form of self destructive behavior, usually in a way that's going to result in their death or total destitution at the end of the work. So you can already see this emphasis on passion, but also on tragedy. And you consider horror's focus on uh, emotions like fear and how horror is often cloaked in mystery. It's no shock at all that the Romantic movement, with its focus on medievalism, with its focus on the old, would come to fixate on sinister things. And here is Gothic horror. Now, there are many traits of Gothic horror that are what we use to define the parameters of a genre. I doubt that there were many writers who wrote Gothic horror that looked and said, I'm going to write something and then we'll call it Gothic horror. No, they shared elements that we can see as a part of a greater pattern. And we assign those elements and their patterns to a genre. A genre is a classification, a construction we have used to link things together by type. So, when looking at the things that we usually associate with this type of fiction, you have a fascination with aesthetic value and emotion. Logic can be there. There's a great deal of science and reason in works of Gothic horror. But the story is not always bound to them. They are not the only defining feature of the work. Again, not all Romantic authors would have considered themselves antithetical to the Enlightenment. Many of them would have considered themselves part of it. And there's a great deal of, as I'd already mentioned, hypocrisy and paradox built into the whole Enlightenment anyway. So while logic, science, reason, deductive, and inductive are all present in Gothic fiction to some degree, the emotion is really where it's at. So, at the very least, Gothic horror is to some degree romantic. There is almost always a fascination with the old in Gothic horror, whether it's old manors, old castles, old ruins, or things like old stories, old legends, old folk tales. There is a value in the old. There's often a fascination with nature, though this can take many different forms. Sometimes there's this sort of idealization of nature, of its benevolence, where in other areas, particularly if you look at like the later romance-inspired transcendentalist movement, there is the threat of the natural. If you go out into the forest away from society, you could be vulnerable. The Moors in early and late Gothic horror written in England, that is not where you want to be. Bad things happen there. But the natural, whether ferocious and savage and mysterious or beautiful and wonderful, that's also likely to play a part. And because the old and the natural are both present, there's going to be decay. Themes of decay tend to exist in virtually all of Gothic horror. Whether it's the building decaying, the physical decay of the body, the moral and mental decay of a character, decay, death, and the eventual dissolution of good things, all play a part in the horror that is, well, Gothic horror. It's right there in the name. While science and reason are all about rendering what is unknown known, the whole point of Gothic horror is to use the unknown to generate emotional reactions like shock and fear. Thus, Gothic horror relies on the unknown, and even the revelation of making the unknown known often comes with its own terror. Thus, a lot of the whole building suspense and mysteries part of horror in the modern sense owes its origins to the Gothic fiction traditions and thus to further back medievalism. And speaking of medievalism, you'll often see figures from folklore and legend be revived in Gothic fiction, like the vampire, like the golem, like the werewolf, like all sorts of beast critters and curses. Family curses, also a big thing. Magical curses on a bloodline, particularly when we're dealing with works about the aristocracy, no doubt somewhat helped along by inbreeding and uh, knowledge of real world uh, degenerative effects on royal bloodlines. All of that's likely to be present. There will also often be a fixation with social ills, limitations, or something wrong in society that afflicts, or in some way traps the individual. Madness, particularly because one of the greatest mysteries of all time is the human mind, also a constant in this fiction. And what's fascinating is this fixation with mystery often points the author and the readers towards trying to solve the mystery, which you think would be an enlightenment value. And in many ways, it is. But if you read what Edgar Allan Poe has to say about science and how he argues it destroys mystery, you'll find that many romantics find the mystery to be more important than the answer itself. It is the mystery that makes these works function, though the most successful Gothic horror tales also still have a satisfactory answer, or at the very least a climax that gives some form of catharsis. We never receive the answer in A Telltale Heart as to why the man is actually crazy. He claims it was the eye of the old man he murdered, but even that he wasn't so sure about. And there are some people who've come up with a scientific explanation of, well, there's this beetle that creates kind of like a tapping noise, and that could have been what he heard. But in the end, the revelation of a murder due to his own insanity and potentially his conscience, forcing him to reveal it, is the real focus of that story's end, not the mystery, or rather the answer to the mystery of how his brain worked. The mystery and the action is enough. There's often a sense of exoticism, whether that exoticism comes from the past or from distant legends, or sometimes even translation being a framing device of there's this person that experienced this thing and now I get to experience it. You also have a lot of, let's just say, stereotypes that you will recognize in this work. You will often have a virginal young maiden, pure, beautiful, innocent, kind, sensitive. A lot of bad shit's gonna happen to this one. Matilda from the Castle of Otranto, she is really our first our first virginal maiden who's gonna suffer, and they just keep on following after that. You'll often have the opposite type, a foolish woman. She's often older, sometimes related to the virginal maiden, but she's the woman that makes all the mistakes. You'll often have a predatory male figure. He may be a political tyrant, he may be a religious authority, particularly if he's Catholic, he's going to be bad. But this masculine figure will be the source of a lot of the terror, or at least related to it. There may be bandits, ruffians, minions that in some way, shape, or form do the bad guy's will or appear whenever they're needed to, say, facilitate the rescue of the heroine. Supervillain minions, this is their origin. You often have the hero figure, the person who will save the virginal maid, and you often have the setting itself have a sort of character to it. Castle, abbey, weird, more dilapidated manor that used to be a slave plantation, what have you. The actual setting has a character of its own. If you look at the fall of the House of Usher and you see that big crack in the house and how it relates to the family itself, the house is as much a character as they are, and there is symbolic meaning in the house collapsing as the siblings die. These locations, as I'd mentioned, will often be old, have secret passages, have some sort of dark past, much like the characters, and in some way relate to the evils of society gone or society present. There indeed is this whole tradition that revives and continues older traditions of some people just being pure evil, not necessarily having rational motives, the desire for evil being enough. You'll often also see this focus on the human mind and the psychological as a source of horror. Indeed, psychological horror, contrary to what you might think, is more romantic in origin than Enlightenment logic in origin. The mystery of the human mind and what we do is where that fear really comes from. Night journeys and the dark and how darkness obscures things also often going to be a part of it. And again, religion, particularly Catholicism, will be tied to it. There is this odd fascination a lot of British writers had with Catholicism, particularly because it's old and creepy, and you've got that whole distance from Catholicism that came with the Protestant Reformation, but you also have that fascination with it. And when you consider the stereotypes of the time and these perceptions of the Catholic Church as being corrupt and anachronistic, it makes sense why they turn into such a horrific thing. So that whole trope of evil Catholics, oh, it's big time present in town Gothic horror population. Just about any Gothic horror work that includes the Catholics. A lot of cultural exchange would lead to continental horror tropes making it to England, and this exchange of German, French, and English writers between themselves. And you also see a revival of the literary genre that for a while dominated the late 18th century and kept it alive into the 19th century. And from there, you see the later generations of stories that we are often more familiar with, at the very least, that are more often made into movies, that are present in the Western canon that is taught in schools, including Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and even works like Carmilla and Dracula and the like. And you also have its transition to the New World. So as Gothic horror was dying out and transforming in Europe, it hit the Americas in a big, big way, particularly because of the Civil War and in the post-Civil War Reconstruction era. Oftentimes, you will see the connections between the chivalric European past twisted in the Southern Gothic tale. The manorial system will be replaced by the plantation system. And this makes a sort of sense when you consider the types of stories and meta-narrative that the Southern gentry created about themselves and their sense of his aristocratic agrarian values that were in many ways European in nature. Thus, these European types of stories transitioned very well. The bleak settings of Europe and its forests and moors and swamps and all that would be replaced with the South, often the Deep South. You would still have flawed, disturbed characters, some of pure evil. You had evil religious characters, although this time they would often be Protestant and evangelical and otherwise very deeply religious and using religion as an excuse, rather than the Machiavellian complex social structures of the Catholic Church. It'll be more individualistic in nature. That's probably the best way to put it. You will also see that the South and the whole manorial system will often have themes of decay associated with it. As forests and creeks will often be devoid of life rather than filled with life, as you'd see in more kind of like the Savage South style story. When you look at Southern Gothic horror, moral decay is also present, particularly tied to the institution of slavery and antebellum Southern culture. In a way, no one is untouched by this systemic evil in this sort of writing. Even poor people who didn't own slaves were often condemned to poverty because of rich people using slave labor, the social class restraining them, and often being at the mercy of those who commit evil or facilitate evil through their own tacit acknowledgement and ignoring of the crimes of the aristocracy. You can also see this in a lot of works. I find that A Rose for Emily is one of the best examples of this, particularly as the town moves on, but still keeps a lot of its harmful cultural traditions and allows Emily in her decaying house and her madness to stew and eventually get away with the things that allow her to murder a man and presumably commit lots of necrophilia. Go check out that story sometime. I've actually gotten to teach that one in classes, so that one's a whole lot of fun. I'm rather familiar with it, having taught it for so many years. But moving on with that, I also want to look at how the Gothic horror genre and Southern Gothic horror and their many derivatives continue to change with the rise of the pulps and the growing audience that would consume popular media. These Gothic tales would easily fill this new entertainment niche that thrived on cheap to print, easy to produce in mass quantities works. Again, that sort of paradoxical romanticism mixed with mass production that creates the popular culture of Gothic fiction. It's present here, as it is just about anywhere else. The very same things that many of the writers rail against are what allow them to do what they do in the first place. And you could say the same thing of the Enlightenment. Social conflict, hypocrisy, all sorts of things often go into political movements and the literature that they shape. And the pulps would see the birth of a lot of different traditions that we would recognize today. Gothic fiction is also the origin of the mystery genre. While there were mystery stories throughout human history, I think the oldest one appears in the Arabian Nights, with Jafar actually as the main protagonist. That's where the Aladdin movie gets its villain from, and he's the good guy in that story, but okay. You had Judge Dee in China, who was, I think, one of the oldest serialized detective stories. But it is really with Edgar Allan Poe and authors that came after him, Doyle being perhaps the most famous, that solidified the mystery genre. And the mystery genre is rooted in romanticism rather than classicalism and rationalism and enlightenment. Why? Because the mystery is the point of the story. Yes, the answer matters, but most of the story is driven by what is unknown and the emotions that evokes. Yes, logic plays a role very often in determining the answer, either through deductive or inductive reasoning. And by the way, the one Sherlock Holmes uses is probably not the one that you think. At least most often. I tend to find that he uses inductive reasoning more than deductive. But hey, Romantic and Gothic authors, like Edgar Allan Poe, are the birth of that genre. Similarly, science fiction has its origins in Romanticism, not in the more Enlightenment writings. Why? Because the moralistic tales attacking questions of the unknown, even if it is through the means of science, technology, and progress, is more the purview of the Romantics, particularly in the things that many of these early science fiction works challenged. Look at a lot of the first science fiction works to appear, and I would include Frankenstein in this, and you'll see that there are a lot of challenges to the notion of progress and the idea that human beings are all that different from the past and that there are lines that we shouldn't cross. All these things are themes that you would often see in Romantic and Gothic works. And if you look at modern horror genres today, you can see that many of them have also been shaped by these Gothic traditions. A lot of the horror film industry, particularly Universal and Paramount's dominance in the early horror film genre in the United States, is because they drew on Gothic works, Gothic figures, Gothic traditions, and it's hard to not associate those figures with the whole Gothic aesthetic. And even now, in our current horror renaissance, a lot of the themes and ideas present in Gothic works are still around. You can see this in things like It Follows. You can see this in Hereditary. You can see this in even a lot of Stephen King fiction. I think his most Gothic work would probably have to be considered The Shining. that whole hotel thing with madness, the family being separated, the house is evil. Oh my gosh, it is Gothic to the core. But there are Gothic elements in a lot of his work. The whole hillbilly horror genre, it's really a descendant of the Southern Gothic tale. Sometimes it'll be mixed more with the savage South, but themes of decay, moral degradation, the systemic evils of humanity, isolation, they're all there. H.P. Lovecraft and the genre of cosmic horror is perhaps one of the most interesting and unique offshoots of this. Particularly when I say that, I mean it's interesting because of the logical leaps it would take to get there. It doesn't necessarily seem Gothic on the outside. I'm not saying it's the one that you should all be fascinated with, but it is definitely quite a leap. The reason I say this is because the whole idea of humans being small and the cosmic being terrifying and the very facets that make it work seem to be more the advent of realist literary movements. But actually, the focus on the mystery, the unveiling of the mystery, and the answer being so horrible as to break the mind of someone to lead to insanity, the question of dream versus reality, and the fragility of the human mind, our small place in the world that still consumes our every waking thought. All of these things are hallmarks of the Gothic movement, not of more realist works. So even though science may be a trapping of some cosmic horror stories, it's the human emotion and rawness that is built around the mystery and its answer that really fuels cosmic horror. And you can see this in a lot of H.P. Lovecraft's works. And I find that the evolution of the two is very clearly demonstrated in the video game, surprisingly enough, Bloodborne. Bloodborne starts as a seeming Gothic horror story that evolves into a full cosmic horror story. But there was never really a separation between the two. You thought you were getting one thing, you got the other, but they are indelibly partners in crafting that terror. Many of the figures and monsters of Gothic horror get reworked for cosmic horror, or things like hillbilly horror, modern supernatural horror like stories of witches and possession. Heck, even Twilight is just knee deep in romantic and Gothic era traditions. So even works that have moved out of the horror genre and traditions that have followed them still have their roots all the way back into that whole Gothic fiction fixation with the traits that we talked about earlier. Modern horror entertainment and storytelling, as it is now, would not exist without the whole Gothic horror tradition. So, to the Gothic horror writers and other Gothic artists and related peoples who made all this possible, thank you for all of the sleepless nights you have caused me, for all the bonding I had with my father over scary stories, for all of the ways the scary stories have inspired me, for all the wonderful monsters that I filled my life with or ran from, and really for a great time. Thanks so much, Gothic horror. And I mean that without sarcasm. Check it out sometime. Read some more Gothic horror, everyone. Until then, take care.